In the ashes of the 20th century lies a nightmare that still chills humanity, the blood empire of Adolf Hitler. At his side stood his fanatic lieutenants, Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda who turned lies into weapons, Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the concentration camps who transformed murder into an assembly line, and Hermann Göring, the power-hungry commander who unleashed waves of bombs across Europe. Together, they built a killing machine unlike anything the world had ever seen, cities reduced to ash, armies crushed, and behind barbed wire, millions of men, women, and children turned into smoke. 60 million lives were taken, including 6 million Jews, alongside the Roma, the disabled, and all those deemed unworthy of life. This is not just history, it is a warning. A reminder that silence, fanaticism, and blind obedience can open the door to monsters. Tonight, we step back into the darkness. This is the story of the blood machine. The dawn of darkness. In the suffocating shadow that blanketed Europe after the First World War, Germany staggered under the unbearable weight of defeat. The Treaty of Versailles struck like a blade across the throat of a wounded nation. Its terms were merciless, territories ripped away, colonies seized, armies dismantled until only a skeleton remained, and reparations so crushing that even generations yet unborn would feel their chains. Pride, once the heartbeat of the German people, was shattered. The soil of Germany lay barren, fields untended, factories silent. Crowds of men returned from the trenches only to discover there was no work, no dignity, no future. Mothers queued for hours just to buy bread, clutching wheelbarrows full of worthless paper currency, watching helplessly as prices soared higher by the hour. A loaf that cost a few marks one morning could demand millions by nightfall. Starvation lurked in kitchens, despair took root in every home. And on the faces of the German people, the same questions were etched in hollow eyes: who had betrayed us? Who had led us into such ruin? Where was salvation to be found? The hunger for a savior grew as relentless as the hunger for food. What they longed for was not merely bread, but vengeance. Not just relief, but resurrection. They yearned for a hand of iron to seize the nation by the throat and force it back into greatness. From within this storm of misery, a name began to echo. A name few outside Germany had ever heard, a man so small in stature that he might have been lost in the crowd were it not for the fire burning in his eyes and the venom dripping from his tongue. Adolf Hitler. He had been a failed painter, a failed student, a failed soldier, a drifter wandering the streets of Vienna and Munich with no prospects, no fortune, no family. Yet here he was, rising from obscurity like a phantom conjured from the collective rage of a broken nation. In the smoky beer halls of Munich, he clambered onto a rickety wooden podium, his voice trembling at first, then sharpening into a whip-crack of fury. And with every sentence, every shouted accusation, the crowd leaned closer. They did not merely listen, they surrendered themselves. Hitler had discovered his weapon, words. Words like poison, injected straight into the veins of the angry and the desperate. He screamed of betrayal, of humiliation, of vengeance. He told them Germany had not been defeated honorably on the battlefield, but stabbed in the back by traitors at home. He pointed his finger at the Jews, branding them parasites, leeches, the hidden enemy within. To others he gave the name of vermin, Roma, communists, the disabled, anyone who did not fit his twisted vision of purity. And then he painted a dream. Not a modest dream of recovery or reform, but a fevered hallucination, a new Reich, a 1,000-year empire, greater and more powerful than Rome had ever been. At its pinnacle, the Aryan master race would reign supreme, lords of all humanity. But dreams such as these were not built with diplomacy or compassion. To carve this empire into existence, Hitler whispered, blood must be spilled. Rivers of blood. The message spread like a plague. The hopeless, the jobless, the bitter veterans who still carried the mud of the trenches on their boots, all flocked to him. He offered them not bread, but purpose, not peace, but power. Street thugs donned brown uniforms, the stormtroopers of the SA, and took to the alleys with fists, knives, and clubs. They beat political rivals in broad daylight, burned the offices of newspapers that dared to oppose them, and left bodies broken in the gutter as warnings to all who resisted. The German people watched in awe and terror. To some, Hitler was a lunatic. To others, he was the only man unafraid to do what had to be done. As violence spread, so too did his aura. He became not just a speaker but an embodiment of brutal strength, a messiah of vengeance cloaked in rage. And then, in January of 1933, the unthinkable happened. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. It was a moment that marked the death of the fragile Weimar Republic and the birth of something monstrous. Within months, through cunning manipulation and ruthless intimidation, he transformed the machinery of democracy into an apparatus of tyranny. Opponents were arrested. Newspapers silenced. Political prisons filled until there was no more room. Then came the fire, the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, consumed in flames under suspicious circumstances. From those ashes, Hitler crafted the Enabling Act, a law that handed him power unchecked, absolute. With a stroke of the pen, he became more than chancellor. He became the Führer. Nazi Germany was no longer a political party. It was a bone-crushing machine. The Gestapo emerged as its black-clad shadow, a secret police force that thrived on whispers and fear. At night, doors were kicked in, and dissenters vanished into darkness. Families awoke to discover loved ones simply gone, swallowed whole by the regime. The first concentration camps were built. At the beginning they held political enemies, communists, intellectuals, priests who dared to speak out. But the camps were not prisons. They were laboratories, testing grounds for cruelty. Behind barbed wire, under the watchful eyes of SS guards, the blueprint of a far greater horror began to take shape. On the surface, Germany glittered with pageantry. Propaganda films flooded cinemas, parades thundered through the streets, swastikas unfurled across stadiums and schools. And at the center of it all was Hitler, his image polished to shine like a savior, his speeches broadcast like scripture. But behind that mask of glory, behind the blinding lights and banners, were the cold eyes of a man who signed death warrants without hesitation. Hitler never trembled. He never hesitated. In his mind, mercy was weakness, and weakness had no place in the empire he sought to build. By the late 1930s, the world still slumbered, blind to the storm building on the horizon. Leaders in London and Paris hoped that appeasement would tame him, that feeding the wolf a scrap of land would satisfy its hunger. But inside Germany, the thunder of marching boots echoed through every city and village, a rhythm of conquest that promised only blood. The dawn of darkness had come. Hitler, once a drifter and a nobody, had become the Führer. And from this moment forward, his shadow would stretch across the earth, casting death upon millions and plunging humanity into its most terrible nightmare. The Blood Machine, Part 1, Prelude to War and Blitzkrieg. The year was 1939, and Europe was holding its breath. The continent had lived through one great war and swore there would never be another. 20 years of fragile peace, of promises, of treaties written in ink that was already fading. But in the heart of Germany, a storm was gathering, and Adolf Hitler, now master of the Reich, hungered for more. He had already swallowed Austria in 1938, the Anschluss presented as the joyous return of German blood to the Reich. Crowds cheered as tanks rolled into Vienna, not realizing the shadow of conquest was tightening around their necks. That same year, he carved into Czechoslovakia, tearing away the Sudetenland under the eyes of the world. Britain and France signed the Munich Agreement, trading territory for a promise of peace. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home waving a paper, declaring, "Peace for our time." But peace was an illusion. Hitler's hunger could never be satisfied. Every territory taken only fed his belief that destiny favored him. He was not content with lands reclaimed or borders redrawn. He wanted empire. He wanted domination. And he wanted blood. The world still hoped he could be appeased. Diplomats whispered, generals hesitated, nations clung to the memory of the last war, praying to avoid another. But Hitler had already set his sights east. On the 1st of September, 1939, the wolf bared its teeth. At dawn, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Simultaneously, the sky filled with the drone of bombers, and the earth shook with the rumble of tanks. Germany's war machine had been unleashed, and it moved with terrifying speed. Blitzkrieg. Lightning war. It was not simply a military tactic. It was psychological terror refined into strategy. Columns of panzers roared across the frontier like metallic beasts. Infantry surged behind, supported by screaming Stuka dive bombers whose sirens wailed to freeze blood in the veins of civilians below. Bridges collapsed, trains derailed, villages burned. The Wehrmacht did not advance, it devoured. Poland fought, but resistance was hopeless. Its cavalry charged bravely, swords flashing, against tanks of steel and fire. Cities became battlegrounds, Warsaw itself reduced to rubble under relentless bombardment. Civilians scattered in panic, fleeing on roads already choked with refugees, only to be strafed by aircraft above. Within weeks, Poland was broken. On September 17, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling a secret pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that divided Poland like carrion between wolves. The Polish state ceased to exist, its people condemned to occupation, execution, and terror. For Poland's Jewish population, centuries of life in Europe became a death sentence. The Nazis forced them into ghettos, Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow. Entire communities walled off from the world, packed into disease-ridden streets where hunger gnawed day by day. Corpses lay in alleys, children starved in silence, families clung to scraps of bread. But Hitler's ambition did not pause. Denmark fell in a single day in April 1940. Norway followed, its fjords echoing with the thunder of German warships. In May, the Blitzkrieg struck westward, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. Fortresses crumbled, armies collapsed, and civilians fled by the millions. The sky itself seemed to rain fire. France, proud France, thought its Maginot Line would hold. But German tanks bypassed it through the Ardennes, a forest deemed impassable. In 6 weeks, France fell. Paris, the city of light, stood in darkness under the swastika. The tricolor flag was lowered, and Hitler himself strode through the conquered capital, posing before the Eiffel Tower as if the world itself were his trophy. The speed was breathtaking, the terror absolute. Europe, a continent of ancient empires and proud nations, now knelt under the boot of a man once dismissed as a failed artist. Refugees clogged the roads, pushing carts piled with whatever they could salvage. Families torn apart, fathers executed, mothers weeping, children lost in the chaos of retreat. But conquest alone was not enough. For Hitler, domination was only the surface of his dream. Beneath it lay something darker, the vision of a cleansed continent, purged of all he deemed impure. Conquest opened the door. Now, he would step through with murder. Behind the front lines came the architects of death. SS units, Gestapo officers, and the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed the army's advance. Their orders were clear. Identify the Jews, the communists, the undesirable, and eradicate them. Villages were encircled, men dragged from their homes, women and children driven to fields or forests. Machine guns rattled, and the soil drank rivers of blood. Mass graves were dug by the victims themselves, who were then shot into them. And while bullets did their work in the countryside, another plan was being drafted in shadowed rooms. Bureaucrats sat at polished tables, shuffling papers, stamping documents. They called it resettlement. They called it the Jewish question. They did not call it by its true name, extermination. The final solution was being born. Trains became the arteries of death. Packed with human cargo, men, women, children, jammed into cattle cars with no air, no water, no food. The journey itself killed thousands, suffocated, trampled, starved before they even reached their destination. Those who survived arrived at camps whose names would echo forever in infamy. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Dachau. Upon arrival, deception continued. Families were told they were being resettled. They were ordered to line up. To the left, labor. To the right, death. A flick of a hand decided fate. Mothers clutched infants, old men leaned on canes, children stared in confusion. One group was marched to barracks, the other to buildings disguised as showers. Inside, Zyklon B pellets dropped from above. Panic. Screams. Nails clawing at steel doors. Minutes later, silence. Then came the roar of the crematoria, flames devouring what remained. Smoke drifted into the sky, carrying with it the ashes of thousands. Death was no longer a byproduct of war. It had become the very purpose. It was mechanized, industrialized, calculated with chilling precision. Bodies piled in mountains. Teeth torn out for gold fillings. Hair shorn for cloth. Bones crushed, ashes scattered. Nothing wasted, nothing spared. Humanity itself was stripped and consumed. 6 million Jews would perish in this machinery of annihilation. Millions of others, the Roma, the disabled, political prisoners, Slavs, homosexuals, were also marked as unworthy of life. In Hitler's Europe, existence itself was a crime punishable by death. But while the Holocaust devoured millions, the war itself bled tens of millions more. Hitler turned his eyes eastward, to the vast plains of the Soviet Union. In June 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers surged forward, a tide of steel and fire stretching hundreds of miles. Behind them came the Einsatzgruppen, their orders simple and monstrous: kill. Villages were encircled. Men lined against walls. Women and children marched to pits in the earth. The crackle of machine guns filled the air. Soil turned red. Forests hid mass graves that still whisper beneath the earth in Ukraine and Belarus. Babi Yar, where 33,000 Jews were slaughtered in 2 days, became a symbol of this apocalypse. Yet in the east, Hitler's machine met resistance unlike any it had faced. At Stalingrad, the frozen city on the Volga, German soldiers starved, froze, and bled among the ruins. The once invincible Wehrmacht was ground into dust. And still Hitler did not falter. He demanded more lives, more sacrifices, more death. His empire was built on corpses, and he would not stop feeding it. By now, Europe was nothing less than a graveyard. Bombs fell on London, firestorms consumed Hamburg and Dresden, civilians cowered between armies and ideologies. And everywhere, the shadow of Hitler loomed, the architect of death, the cold eye above the storm. He had turned Germany into a furnace and Europe into its fuel. And still he did not tremble. Still he did not hesitate. For Hitler, every corpse was a stepping stone, every atrocity a necessity, every scream of the dying the soundtrack of his empire of blood. This was the blood machine. And only when its wheels began to grind to a halt, choked by rivers of corpses and the advance of enemy armies, did the end begin to approach. Part 2, Barbarossa, the Holocaust, and a Continent in Flames. June 22, 1941. Dawn broke across the vast fields of Eastern Europe. Farmers stirred in villages that had stood for centuries, unaware that history's greatest invasion was about to shatter their world. Operation Barbarossa had begun. More than 3 million German soldiers surged across an 1,800-mile front. Panzers ground forward through the dust, aircraft roared overhead, and artillery thundered like the wrath of the gods. It was an onslaught so vast, so relentless, that it seemed to blot out the very horizon. Villages woke to the scream of Stuka sirens, to fire raining from the sky, to the earth shaking under steel tracks. For Hitler, the war in the East was not simply conquest. It was annihilation. He called it a war of ideology, a war of races. The Slavs, he declared, were inferior, destined only for slavery or extinction. The Jews were parasites, to be exterminated root and branch. The communists were vermin to be crushed without mercy. This was not to be a conventional war, it was to be a war of extermination. The Wehrmacht surged forward, advancing hundreds of miles in weeks. Minsk fell, then Smolensk, then Kiev. Red Army divisions crumbled, millions of Soviet soldiers captured. Yet behind the front lines, a darker army followed, the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads. They traveled in trucks and cars, carrying rifles and machine guns. Their orders were chilling in their simplicity: eliminate Jews, communists, and anyone deemed undesirable. And they obeyed with mechanical precision. Villages were encircled. Orders barked. Families driven from their homes. Men separated from women, children clutching their mothers. They were marched to fields, to forests, to ravines. Forced to dig their own graves. Then, the crack of gunfire. Row after row fell. Bodies tumbled into pits. Dirt shoveled over them, sometimes while they still breathed. Babi Yar. September 29 and 30, 1941. In the ravine outside Kiev, 33,771 Jews were massacred in 2 days. The air filled with the roar of machine guns, the screams of the dying, the sobs of the living. The earth itself seemed to weep as thousands were buried beneath it. And Babi Yar was not alone. Similar massacres scarred the land from Ukraine to Belarus, from Lithuania to Russia. Entire Jewish communities, centuries old, were wiped from existence in a matter of hours. But bullets alone were too slow, too inefficient for the industrial scale of murder Hitler envisioned. The ghettos, already overflowing with disease and hunger, became holding pens for a greater slaughter. In January 1942, at a villa on the shores of a Berlin lake, high-ranking Nazis gathered for the Wannsee Conference. Over cigars and brandy, they discussed logistics, not of transport or supply, but of extermination. 11 million Jews across Europe were marked for death. The language was bureaucratic, almost polite. Evacuation to the east. Special treatment. But behind the euphemisms lay genocide. Trains would carry victims from every corner of Europe, France, Holland, Hungary, Greece, Poland, into the heart of darkness. Their destinations, extermination camps. Auschwitz. Treblinka. Sobibor. Belzec. Majdanek. Chelmno. The names would become synonymous with hell. At Auschwitz, new arrivals were met by SS officers who directed them with a flick of the hand. To the left, labor. To the right, death. Mothers clutching infants, children too young to work, the elderly, the sick, all were herded into buildings disguised as showers. The doors sealed. Zyklon B pellets dropped from vents. Panic, screams, fingernails clawing steel. Minutes later, silence. When the doors opened, bodies lay tangled, mouths frozen in terror. The corpses were dragged to crematoria. Gold teeth ripped from jaws. Hair shorn from heads, packed into sacks. Bones ground into powder, ashes dumped into rivers or scattered over fields. Nothing wasted. Nothing spared. Death itself had become a factory, an industry running day and night. At Treblinka, trains arrived daily, each carrying thousands. Within hours, nearly all were dead. So efficient was the killing that only a handful survived the camp to tell the tale. One of them, years later, recalled, Treblinka was not a camp. It was a machine. You went in alive, and you came out as smoke. By 1943, the Holocaust raged at full force. 6 million Jews would perish. Alongside them, Roma, the disabled, homosexuals, prisoners of war, and millions of Slavic civilians. Entire cultures erased, entire families obliterated. A continent was being bled dry, its soil soaked with ashes, its rivers carrying the dust of the dead. Meanwhile, the war itself consumed tens of millions more. The siege of Leningrad dragged on for 872 days. The city starved in an icy tomb, cut off from food and supplies. Dogs, cats, even wallpaper paste became sustenance. Yet the people endured, defying Hitler's command that the city be starved into submission. In Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht met its breaking point. The frozen ruins became a charnel house. Soldiers fought room by room, basement by basement, among shattered walls and frozen corpses. Supplies dwindled. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Men froze where they stood, their bodies stiff in trenches. By February 1943, the once invincible German Sixth Army surrendered. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was the turning of the tide. But even as defeat loomed, Hitler's fanaticism deepened. He demanded more lives, more sacrifices. Retreat was forbidden. Cities that wavered were punished with annihilation. Entire populations executed for disloyalty. The blood machine devoured not only its victims, but its own soldiers, grinding down Germany itself into ruin. Across Europe, cities burned. London endured night after night of bombing in the Blitz. Coventry reduced to rubble. Hamburg incinerated in a firestorm, tens of thousands suffocating as flames sucked the oxygen from the air. Dresden, a jewel of culture, became an inferno, its people boiled alive in streets of molten asphalt. By 1944, Europe was less a continent than a graveyard. The fields of France, the forests of Poland, the steppes of Russia, all scarred with graves. Millions displaced, millions dead, millions more waiting for death in camps that worked without pause. And still, Hitler did not tremble. Still he did not hesitate. Every corpse was a stepping stone, every atrocity a necessity. In his mind, cruelty was not failure, it was strength. He had turned Germany into a furnace, and Europe into its fuel. This was the blood machine in its fullest horror, war and genocide fused into one, feeding each other, consuming all. The Fall and the Legacy of Blood. Part 1, The Crumbling Fronts, 1943 to 1944. By the year 1943, the blood machine that Hitler had built was grinding forward still, but its wheels no longer spun with the same merciless speed. For 4 years it had devoured nations, enslaved peoples, and consumed lives in fire and smoke. But now, its engines screamed and stuttered, choking on the vastness of its own ambition. The tide of war was turning, and though the Nazi state fought with fanatical ferocity, the cracks of collapse were spreading across its once invincible empire. The turning point, Kursk. After the frozen nightmare of Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army had been swallowed whole, Hitler's generals begged for a pause, for time to rebuild. But Hitler, drunk on ideology and blind to reality, demanded more. He dreamed of one last decisive blow in the East, one strike that would smash the Soviets and restore the myth of invincibility. That blow came at Kursk in the summer of 1943. It was the largest tank battle the world had ever seen. Hundreds upon hundreds of armored beasts clashed across the rolling fields, panthers and tigers against T-34s. The earth shook as if the gods themselves were at war. Smoke, fire, and the roar of engines merged into one endless scream. For days the battle raged. German tanks pushed forward, carving deep into Soviet lines, but the Red Army had prepared. Mines littered the fields, artillery rained from the skies, and endless waves of Soviet reserves slammed against the German advance. What Hitler had hoped would be a decisive strike became a slaughter. By the end, the Wehrmacht had lost thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of men. The tide of the Eastern Front had shifted forever. From Kursk onward, the German army was on the defensive. The Fall and the Legacy of Blood. By 1943, the machine that had once devoured continents began to shudder. The Reich still stretched from the Atlantic to the steppes of Russia, but its edges were fraying, its arteries clogged with blood and smoke. The turning of the tide had come, and though Hitler screamed for victory, the shadow of defeat grew longer with every passing month. The crumbling fronts, 1943 to 1944. In the east, the fields of Kursk became the graveyard of German ambition. Hitler threw his new armored beasts, panthers and tigers, into battle, hoping to crush the Red Army in one decisive strike. Instead, the largest tank battle in history erupted, steel clashed against steel, fire rained from the skies, and the ground trembled under the weight of thousands of engines. Mines shredded treads, artillery pounded columns, Soviet waves poured in without end. When the smoke cleared, it was Germany, not Russia, that lay broken. The Wehrmacht would never again seize the initiative. In the south, the Allies struck at Italy. Mussolini was toppled, his people turning against him. German paratroopers plucked him from captivity, but his empire was gone. From Sicily northward, the Allies clawed their way up the peninsula. At Monte Cassino, bombs obliterated an ancient monastery, burying centuries of history under rubble. Villages burned, civilians starved, the soft underbelly of Europe became a wound that bled the Reich dry. From the west came fire from the skies. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, all felt the wrath of Allied bombers. Operation Gamara in July 1943 unleashed a firestorm so fierce that oxygen itself was consumed, dragging people screaming into walls of flame. Dresden followed in 1945, where the night sky glowed brighter than day, asphalt melted into rivers, and tens of thousands were incinerated in hours. For the German people, who had once cheered parades of conquest, war had come home as a storm of fire. And then came Normandy. June 6, 1944. The horizon off France filled with ships, thousands of them, blotting out the sea. Allied soldiers charged the beaches under withering fire, wading through waves that turned red. Omaha was a slaughterhouse, but the tide could not be turned back. By nightfall, the Allies had a foothold. By August, Paris was free. The Reich was collapsing from every direction, hammered in the east by the Soviets, invaded in the south through Italy, shattered in the west by D-Day. The thousand-year empire was crumbling after barely 12. The camps overflow. But while armies clashed on battlefields, behind barbed wire another war continued, one fought not with tanks but with starvation, disease, and systematic murder. The camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, overflowed with victims. Trains still arrived daily, their human cargo pressed into cattle cars with no air, no food, no hope. Guards shoved the weak and the sick onto platforms. Selections were swift, a hand to the left for labor, a hand to the right for death. Inside Auschwitz, crematoria belched smoke day and night. The gas chambers consumed thousands at a time. But even this machinery faltered as the Reich collapsed. Supplies dwindled, fuel ran short, corpses piled faster than they could be burned. Prisoners, skeletal and fevered, stumbled among heaps of the dead. At Bergen-Belsen, typhus swept the barracks, bodies lay unburied, survivors wandered aimlessly with eyes like hollow caves. As Allied troops drew near, the SS tried to erase the evidence. Crematoria were destroyed, documents burned, mass graves unearthed and incinerated. But the scale of the crime was too vast to hide. Instead, prisoners were forced onto death marches. Columns of emaciated men, women, and children staggered through snow and mud, driven westward at gunpoint. Those who stumbled were shot where they fell. Roads across Germany became lined with frozen corpses. The machine was collapsing, but it killed faster than ever. Even in defeat, Hitler demanded extermination to the last breath. For him, genocide was not strategy, it was obsession. The fall of Berlin, 1945. By April 1945, the jaws of war closed upon the heart of the Reich. From the west came the Americans, British, and French, driving through the Rhineland. From the east, the Red Army surged, its banners already planted in the ruins of Warsaw, Budapest, and Vienna. Berlin was the final prize. The city had once been the proud capital of empire. Now it was a carcass. Rubble filled the streets, bridges lay in ruins, food had vanished. Civilians cowered in basements as Soviet artillery thundered day and night. Entire districts were reduced to dust. In the streets, old men and boys of the Hitler Youth carried rifles too heavy for their shoulders, ordered to fight to the last bullet. House by house, block by block, the Soviets advanced. Flamethrowers turned basements into infernos. Grenades rolled down stairwells. Snipers hunted from shattered windows. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire, their screams lost beneath the roar of battle. Berlin had become a slaughterhouse, its gutters running with blood. And beneath this collapsing city, in the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler raved. Surrounded by sycophants and generals too terrified to speak truth, he issued orders to divisions that no longer existed. He blamed betrayal, cursed his people as weak, demanded vengeance against shadows. Maps covered in red arrows closed in on his sanctuary, but he clung to delusion. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet troops only blocks away, Hitler ended his life. A pistol shot, a cyanide capsule, a body burned in a garden already drowned in fire. The man who had turned Europe into a furnace would never face the judgment of the living. Berlin fell within days. The Reich surrendered in May. The guns fell silent, but silence did not bring peace. It brought revelation. Allied soldiers who entered the camps wept at what they found: mountains of corpses, survivors too weak to walk, warehouses filled with human hair, shoes, glasses. The remnants of millions reduced to ash. The blood machine was finally broken. But its ashes covered all of Europe. Its legacy was carved not in stone, but in bone and smoke and silence. The liberation and revelation. When the guns finally began to fall silent in the spring of 1945, the Allies moved deeper into the territories that had been consumed by the Reich. Victory was close, but what awaited them behind the barbed wire and watchtowers was not triumph, it was horror. At Buchenwald, American troops entered through the gates expecting prisoners of war. What they found were skeletons still breathing, men and women so emaciated they seemed more ghost than flesh. Piles of bodies lay unburied, rotting in the sun, their eyes staring lifeless into nothing. The stench of death clung to every corner. Soldiers hardened by years of battle covered their faces and wept. Some vomited, unable to stand the sight. At Dachau, rows of railcars stood outside the camp, each packed with corpses. The dead were crammed so tightly that their limbs intertwined like tangled roots. Survivors stumbled forward, whispering thanks in a dozen languages, their voices too weak to carry. American soldiers forced nearby townspeople to march through the camp, to confront the crimes they had ignored or pretended not to see. Many fainted, others turned away in shame. In the north, British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen. There, disease had consumed what bullets had not. Thousands of bodies lay strewn across the camp, too many to bury, too many to count. Survivors wandered aimlessly, delirious with fever, their ribs protruding like cages around hollow stomachs. Typhus raged through the barracks. One British doctor, faced with the impossible, could only describe the place as beyond humanity. But it was Auschwitz that revealed the full scale of the horror. When the Red Army arrived in January 1945, they found warehouses filled with shoes, mountains of spectacles, tons of human hair. Each object was a testimony, each item a life stolen. The crematoria were still warm. Paths were lined with ash. The ghosts of over 1 million men, women, and children haunted every brick, every rail track, every shadow. The world reeled. Newspapers printed photographs, but the images seemed unreal, too monstrous to be true. People asked, how could this have happened? How could human beings build factories of death, turn murder into industry, strip millions down to ash and smoke? The answer came in the trials. In November 1945, in the ruined city of Nuremberg, the victors gathered to bring justice. 22 surviving Nazi leaders stood in the dock, their faces gaunt, their uniforms stripped of insignia. The charges: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The courtroom became a theater of evidence. Films shot by Allied cameramen were played, showing the liberation of camps. Testimonies of survivors filled the chamber with voices of the dead. Documents, signed in neat handwriting, revealed orders for deportations, executions, the final solution. The defense spoke of obedience, of loyalty, of ignorance. But the evidence was overwhelming. For the first time in history, the world declared that there are crimes so vast, so monstrous, that they transcend nations and armies. Justice at Nuremberg was imperfect, but it was a beginning. The word genocide entered human language. Humanity stared into the abyss it had created, and gave it a name. The legacy of blood. The numbers defied comprehension. More than 60 million people dead. Cities reduced to rubble. An entire continent scarred with graves. Among them, 6 million Jews deliberately exterminated, erased from their homes, their families, their futures. Roma, the disabled, homosexuals, political prisoners, millions more silenced because they did not fit the image of Hitler's twisted dream. The survivors carried scars that could never heal. Some bore tattoos etched into their arms, numbers in blue ink that reduced them to entries in a ledger of death. Others carried memories of trains, of chimneys, of screams in the night. Children grew up without parents, without siblings, haunted by absences more painful than wounds. For Europe, the legacy was a silence heavy with shame. Entire towns in Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, once alive with Jewish voices, were gone. Languages vanished. Songs fell silent. Cemeteries stood untended, their stones cracked, their names forgotten. Culture itself had been murdered. For humanity, the lesson was carved in blood: indifference is complicity. The camps did not rise in secret. The trains ran on public rails. The smoke of crematoria drifted across villages. Ordinary men and women chose to look away. It was silence that gave monsters power. The warning endures. Hatred, when left unchecked, grows like fire. Fanaticism, when embraced, becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. A single voice, if worshipped without question, can lead millions to ruin. The blood machine devoured 60 million lives. Its architect shot himself in a bunker, but the echo of his cruelty lingers still. It whispers in ruins, in photographs, in testimonies. It reminds us that civilization is fragile, that the line between order and barbarity is thin, and that beneath the surface of every society, the abyss waits. The legacy of blood is not only the graves of the millions. It is the eternal warning that monsters are made not only by hatred, but by silence, apathy, and obedience. And it is the duty of the living to remember, because forgetting is the first step toward repetition.